I look back on the time before everything unraveled as though it belonged to a completely different lifetime. Emma and I had been married for 6 years, and to anyone on the outside, our relationship seemed almost flawless. Together, we'd poured our energy and love into building a home, and when we decided to start a family, it felt like the last missing piece was finally falling into place. Of course, our relationship wasn't without its flaws. My job often required me to travel for weeks at a time, and an unspoken loneliness lingered between us, something we never truly confronted. Despite this, I held on to the belief that we could withstand anything life threw our way. When Emma shared the news that she was pregnant, I was ecstatic. The thought of becoming a father filled me with a renewed sense of purpose, and I threw myself into preparing for the arrival of our child. We spent countless hours brainstorming names, decorating the nursery, and imagining what the future held for our growing family. I even took steps to work closer to home, wanting to be present for both Emma and the baby. For months, everything seemed to align beautifully. But little did I know, trouble was already brewing beneath the surface. The scene at the hospital felt picture-perfect, like something out of a vintage painting of family bliss. Not the polished kind you'd see on magazine covers, but real and heartwarming. My mother-in-law stood on one side of the hospital bed, my mom on the other, both watching Emma as she nursed our newborn daughter. Newborns might not be considered classically cute, but to their parents and grandparents, they're nothing short of perfect. As I observed, I couldn't help but agree that our daughter was beautiful. Her blotchy red skin had softened to a rosy pink, and the waxy coating from birth had been gently cleaned away. Even the slight cone shape of her head had smoothed out, leaving her with an angelic look. I couldn't shake the feeling that she'd grow up to look just like her mother, Emma, the woman I'd been married to for 6 years and always believed was the love of my life. I stood quietly, watching Emma nurse while both grandmothers offered well-meaning but unnecessary advice. Emma, however, appeared naturally adept, likely a result of the parenting classes we'd taken together, where topics like breastfeeding and newborn care had been covered in detail. While I lingered near the corner of the room, a nurse and another woman walked in. "This is Miss Carter from administration," the nurse explained, her name escaping me. "She's here with the birth certificate application for you to complete." In any other setting, the sight of a woman nursing her baby without a shirt while others dealt with paperwork might seem odd, but here it felt perfectly normal. "Take your time," Miss Carter said kindly to Emma. "Finish feeding your baby first. When you're ready, just fill out the highlighted sections. Most of the details we need, like your date and place of birth, are likely in the hospital records. But we'll need both your full names, your maiden name, your ages, and a few other things. Once that's done, we'll handle the rest and send it to the parish courthouse. You'll receive a copy of the birth certificate in the mail in a few weeks." With that, Miss Carter left the room. "Honey, could you fill this out?" Emma asked, smiling as she glanced up at me. "I'm a little occupied right now." Her smile didn't provoke the same reaction in me as it once had. "No, I think you should handle it later when you're done with the baby," I replied. Then, without any warning, I added, "Besides, we should probably wait until the DNA test results come back to confirm if I'm really the father." If this moment were a scene in a movie, you'd hear the screech of a record player needle grinding to a halt. The room froze. 3 of the 4 women stared at me, wide-eyed and stunned. The 4th, our daughter, was the only one who wasn't looking, though her sudden cries filled the room after her feeding was interrupted. My mother-in-law was the first to recover. "Have you lost your mind? Why on earth would you say something like that?" she snapped, throwing a worried glance at Emma, whose expression had shifted rapidly from shock to confusion, and then to anger. Emma's voice trembled as she responded. "What are you even implying? How dare you accuse me of having someone else's baby? What kind of person do you think I am?" She paused for a moment, forcing a weak smile. "Oh, I get it now. It's April Fool's Day. You're just trying to play a prank." "Well, it's not funny, Ethan. Not even a little." But her body language betrayed her, her shock and unease impossible to miss. I stood my ground, unfazed. "I'm completely serious," I said, my tone as cold as ice. There's a very real possibility that I'm not the father. Emma's voice rose. How could you even think that? Have I ever given you any reason to doubt me? Name one time I've acted in a way that would make you suspect I'm seeing someone else. I ignored her challenge. So we're sticking with the usual strategy, deny, 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 I said dryly. And you're doing it convincingly, too. I've got to admit, it's impressive. I turned to my mother-in-law. Maybe it's best if you take Emma and the baby home this afternoon. I'll move the car seat from my car to yours. It would also help if you stayed with her for a while. We've turned down your offers before, but now Emma could really use the extra support, especially since I won't be around much. I started to leave the room, but my mother's sharp voice stopped me in my tracks. Ethan James Porter, don't you dare walk out that door. I froze and turned back, steeling myself for the confrontation I knew was coming. My mom and mother-in-law exchanged uneasy glances while Emma sobbed uncontrollably. Through her tears, Emma wailed, "No, you can't just leave me in Grace. She's your baby. You're her daddy." Before I could reply, my mom grabbed my shirt and pulled me close, her piercing eyes locking onto mine. It was the same look she'd given me as a child whenever I was in trouble. "What the hell is wrong with you, Ethan? Have you completely lost your mind? You can't just back out of being a father now, it's done. You were over the moon when Emma told us she was pregnant. You've been devouring baby books, buying everything for the nursery, and even painting it pink and yellow with those little animals. And don't think I didn't notice how every week you brought home a new toy, even ones she won't use for months." She paused, her gaze never wavering. "So what's changed? Why are you suddenly acting like this?" Taking a deep breath, I muttered, "I've had a change of heart. I'm not as sure about this anymore. I think you've all noticed." My mother-in-law interjected. "Oh, we've noticed all right. You haven't held Grace, and you barely look at her. We assumed you were just overwhelmed with the reality of fatherhood. So what's going on? If that baby's mine, I'll do everything to take care of her and be a great father." I declared so intensely that both my mother and Paul stepped back. I was fully committed, but that changed last week when I found out I might not be the father. "I'm not bonding with a child I won't be raising." "What?" came the outcry from three voices, nearly in unison. "I'll provide for her if she's mine. But if not, Henry Dawson can take responsibility for his own child," I said loudly. At the mention of that name, Emma suddenly cried out, "Henry and I never did anything. We've never been physically engaged. How can you accuse me of that?" As I moved closer to the foot of her bed, Mom and Paul exchanged glances, their eyes darting between Emma and me. "Really? You're still going to deny that you had an affair for almost 6 months and only ended it 7 months ago after finding out you were pregnant and telling him? From what I've heard, he told you to make sure I never found out." Emma's face flushed.
"No.
We absolutely did not. Anyone who says otherwise is lying. Who is Henry Dawson, and who told you about this so-called affair?" Paul demanded, her voice rising. "I want to know who's spreading lies about my daughter." Ignoring the first question, I answered the second. "Henry Dawson himself," I said quietly. Before Paul could react, and perhaps because of her exhaustion and distress, Emma blurted it out. "Henry would never tell you that. He promised." Paul looked back and forth between her daughter and me, catching on to Emma's slip. "I need to know exactly what you know," she said firmly. I paused before addressing Emma. "Henry spilled everything. He confessed it all. But, to be fair, he was under a lot of pressure at the time and let it all out in the middle of his screams," I admitted. "That's nonsense," Emma replied, her voice shaky. "Henry was just fine when he called me yesterday to check on me and the baby." Her exhaustion after giving birth was apparent, and she may not have realized the slip-up, but her words hit us all. Paul slumped a bit, and I glanced at my mother, who was wide-eyed, taking it all in. "So, you're still in touch with your old flame?" I said. "Did he give you more advice on how to keep me in the dark about him possibly being the father?" Emma broke down into sobs, her crying so intense that 2 nurses rushed into the room. "We were so careful. There was no way you could have known. No one knew." Emma sobbed. She's just a little overwhelmed, I told the first nurse, who shot me a protective glare on behalf of her patient. I supposed my tone might have sounded odd to her. We were just discussing potential fathers to put on the birth certificate application, I added. The nurse continued to look at me with suspicion. Well, it seems she expects me to fill in my name, but I'd rather wait until we know for sure if I'm the father or if it's the guy she was seeing when she got pregnant. I could tell by the nurse's expression that she was starting to understand. She turned her attention to comforting Emma. Miss Fontenot, let's calm down now. Remember your breathing techniques from labor. Anna will get something to help you relax if needed, but let's try natural methods first. We don't want anything passing into your milk, right? So, let's start with some deep breathing. Inhale with me deeply. As I watched the nurse soothing Emma, I didn't notice my mom and mother-in-law approaching. You need to explain what's going on, my mom whispered sharply. I was startled. Mom rarely spoke this way, but she'd done it twice today. Clearly, something big was happening. Judging by Em's reaction, my mother-in-law added, I want to know the full story. What, when, and how. This is completely unexpected. Well, it should be obvious, I replied, glaring at both women. I was getting annoyed that I was the target of their frustration, not Emma. She was involved with a coworker when she got pregnant, at least one other man besides me. I can't say for sure if there were more. Emma pulled herself together surprisingly fast, considering she'd seemed on the verge of a breakdown just moments earlier. We were so careful, she said, her voice filled with desperation. How? I saw the same questioning look from my mom and Paul. They were eager to know more. Yes, you were very discreet. I had no idea. Neither did anyone else, I admitted. But Henry, being the charming seducer he is, couldn't resist bragging. He needed to show off his conquests, this time his latest one. He couldn't help himself. You know Anna Blake, right? I asked, and Emma nodded. Anna had been her coworker for years. Anna and her husband, Michael, were part of our social circle. Well, Henry almost convinced Anna to meet him at a hotel. Her biggest fear was that he might talk and her husband would find out. She wasn't sure she could trust him to stay quiet. So, to prove he could keep a secret, he spilled the details of his past affairs, whatever you want to call them. Conquests, hookups, girlfriends. He dropped a few names and gave enough details to make her believe him. He even asked if she could guess who else he'd been involved with, excluding his public girlfriends, married women, or single women from work. Of course, she couldn't. So, to further convince her, he mentioned some women from the office she knew. The one before you was Sandy. She backed out after a few months when her husband got suspicious. Then it was you for 6 months. But you ended things when you found out you were pregnant. Henry told Anna you were hoping your husband was the baby's father, but he wasn't willing to keep the affair going. He made sure Anna understood how crucial it was that your husband, meaning me, never found out because he thought I might leave you and not want to deal with child support. During that time, you were very open about your pregnancy. You were happy and shared the news with everyone at work. But despite your excitement, I noticed you didn't show any concern about who the baby's father was. It seemed like you assumed I wouldn't question it. Even if I did, you'd think I'd stay committed to the child and ignore any doubts. But that's not something I was willing to accept. I paused briefly, letting my words sink in. Emma sat frozen, her face betraying a turbulent mix of emotions she struggled to mask. Paul and Mom remained silent, absorbing every word with rapt attention. It was clear they were just as desperate for answers as I was. It turns out Henry's next affair was with Sarah Nolan, I continued, my voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath. Her husband started getting suspicious when she suddenly began working late more often. That caused issues, like being late to pick up their youngest from daycare a few times. Paul and Mom exchanged a wary glance, their expressions growing darker as I went on. With Sarah pulling back, Henry set his sights on Anna, and, unsurprisingly, he succeeded. He's a smooth talker, always knows the right thing to say to make a woman feel special. And apparently he's pretty skilled in bed. That's part of why his married partners kept coming back for more, sometimes for months on end. The room felt heavier, the weight of my words settling over all of us. Mom finally broke the silence. "And how exactly did Anna end up confessing?" she asked, trying to piece everything together. "It wasn't intentional," I replied. "Apparently, Anna's very vocal during moments of intimacy." I hesitated, knowing the next part wouldn't sit well with Paul. She accidentally called out Henry's name in the heat of the moment. Paul winced, her face contorting in discomfort. I didn't blame her. Her husband, Michael, confronted her about it, and under pressure, she confessed. I added with a dry chuckle, recalling Michael's version of events over a few beers. "Anna isn't the type to stay quiet. She's more the directive type during intimacy, you know? Not primal noises like Emma, but the kind who says exactly what she wants." I paused, glancing at the two women. Paul looked horrified, and Mom's expression was unreadable. I forged ahead. According to Michael, one night she blurted out, "Give it to me, Henry. I love it." Naturally, Michael, whose name sounds nothing like Henry, was thrown. And since Michael knew Henry and his reputation as a womanizer, it didn't take long to connect the dots. Mom and Paul stared at me, stunned by the details, their shock evident in their wide eyes and gaping mouths. When Daniel, Sarah's husband, figured things out, he was furious. I said, shifting gears. Being a police officer made it even more complicated for him. He decided to hold off on saying anything until after the baby was born. None of us wanted to add to Emma's stress during the final stages of her pregnancy. But now that Grace is here, it's time to face the fallout. Paul's face turned pale, her disbelief impossible to hide. "So, you're telling me this Henry Dawson had affairs with multiple women, including my daughter, and there's a chance Grace is his child?" Her voice trembled with anger and disappointment. "Yes," I replied bluntly. "And whether Henry knows or not, I doubt he cares about the destruction he's left behind." For a moment, the room fell silent. Then Mom asked the question that hung heavily in the air. "So, what's the next step?" I sighed, the weight of everything pressing down on me. "I've already started the process," I admitted. "I submitted a DNA test the day after Grace was born. Since Emma and I are married, I didn't need her consent to test the baby. I opted for expedited results, so we should have them in 2 or 3 days." Paul's voice was hesitant as she asked, "Do you think you could forgive Emma and move on, even if Grace isn't your biological daughter?" Her choice of words struck me. She referred to Grace as the baby, a small but significant shift from how she usually spoke. It was as though she was distancing herself, perhaps bracing for the worst. I glanced at Mom, who had already deduced my feelings. Her expression was empathetic but tinged with sadness. She knew where this was headed. "Honestly," I said, exhaling deeply, "I'm not sure I can. Even if I'm Grace's father, I don't think I can move past this. This wasn't a one-time mistake, a drunken fling or moment of weakness. It was a 6-month affair. That's 6 months of lies, of risking our marriage, of potentially bringing another man's child into our family while we were actively trying for a baby." I paused, the bitterness creeping into my tone. "Emma told everyone, our families are friends, that we decided to conceive. And yet, she continued her affair with Henry. It's clear to me she didn't care who the father was as long as she didn't lose me in the process." Mom interjected softly, "Have you thought about couples therapy? And remember, the baby is innocent in all of this. Grace will need a father, even if she isn't biologically yours. You could still be her daddy." I sighed again, frustration and sorrow mixing in equal measure. "Mom, I've thought about therapy, but I don't think it'll work. What I really want to know is where I went wrong as a husband. What did I do or fail to do that made Emma betray me like this? She wasn't looking to replace me. Henry's not the committing type, and she had to know that." Shaking my head, I felt the anger bubbling beneath the surface. I'm trying not to say the hard things I'm thinking, but it's tough. Aside from physical attraction or the thrill of it, I can't fathom why she did this. I thought our relationship was solid. Both women remained quiet, letting me continue. "You can't imagine how devastated I've been since finding out. I was so excited to be a dad. And then, just like that, everything fell apart. My entire world crumbled. I hesitated, knowing the next part would shock them. Honestly, at this point, I almost hope I'm not the father. Mom and Paul both stared at me, their surprise written all over their faces. If Grace isn't mine, I explained, I won't have to face being a part-time dad or forcing myself to interact with Emma. It's going to take a lot of therapy just to rebuild myself after this. Just then, the nurse stepped out of Emma's room. Mr. Fontenot, your wife wants to see you, she said, her tone soft but firm. She knows you're still here. Otherwise, her mother would have returned by now. I started toward the door, but the nurse stopped me, her expression sympathetic. If you go in, she said gently, please try to stay calm. I know you're upset, but we'd like to avoid giving her sedatives. She's being discharged this afternoon, and anything that passes into her milk could affect the baby. Remember, colostrum and early breast milk are crucial for the baby's immune system. I nodded, recognizing that the nurse was appealing to my sense of responsibility for the baby's well-being, regardless of whose child she turned out to be. Maybe you should go talk to her, Mom suggested gently. Paul and I will grab some coffee. Hand me your car keys and we'll move the car seat. I'll wait for you to finish. Oh, and before you go, stop by the nursery and take a good look at Grace. I swear she looks a lot like you did as a newborn. I raised an eyebrow. Wishful thinking, Mom? Or are you just seeing what you want to see? She shrugged, her unhappiness with the situation written all over her face. I could tell that if Grace turned out to be mine, Mom would throw herself into her role as a grandmother without hesitation, no matter what happened between Emma and me. She was already emotionally invested, just as I'd been preparing to embrace fatherhood. It was clear she wasn't ready to consider the possibility that Grace might not be her grandchild. When I entered Emma's room, her eyes locked onto mine, and she immediately broke down, her sobs racking her frame. You must hate me, she choked out. I don't hate you. That's the problem, I replied, keeping my tone measured despite the fury boiling inside me. I hate what you did. I'm so angry I can barely think straight. Deep down, I wanted to storm out, to leave her to her regret. If there wasn't even a small chance that Grace was mine, I probably would have walked away already. But I needed answers. Do you really want to talk now? I asked, my voice sharp. Or would you prefer a few more days to figure out how to explain yourself? I don't need days, Emma started, but I cut her off. You've had 9 months, I snapped. 9 months to think about what you'd say if I ever found out. And Henry Dawson, of all people. His name left a bitter taste in my mouth. I paused, taking a few deep breaths to steady myself. No, I didn't think Grace might be his. That was you. I thought I was having our baby, not his. Emma tried to protest, but I cut her off again. I might be Grace's father, but it doesn't look likely, I said bitterly. She stared at me, genuinely shocked by my accusation. I pressed on. Come on, Emma. I was offshore for most of the first week of July, the time frame when you supposedly got pregnant. I double-checked my work schedule to be sure. I remember coming home at the end of the week, and yeah, we made up for lost time right away, just like always, or how we used to. I thought that was when we conceived. That's what I told the guys at work. I had no idea Henry was in the picture. As she opened her mouth to speak, I barreled ahead. What about before that? Before I stepped off the helicopter? Was he in our house while I was gone? Did you have him over? Sleep with him in our bed? The questions came fast, my anger fueling each one. Not that it matters where. It's that you did it. Emma's face turned crimson. No. He never came to the house, she said, her voice rising. The only times he was here were for those barbecues we hosted. We were careful. We didn't want the neighbors to see him or his car parked outside. Not careful enough to avoid getting pregnant. I shot back coldly. Don't try to tell me a condom broke. Henry seems like the type to take risks, to push boundaries as long as it benefits him. I got tested for STDs last week. I suggest you do the same. She muttered softly. That was part of my early pregnancy exams. I paused, momentarily caught off guard. I didn't think that was routine, I said. She looked down, her voice barely above a whisper. I told my doctor I wanted to make sure you hadn't brought something home after being away for work. My face flushed hot with anger. So, your OBGYN thinks I might have been the one cheating? And instead of telling the truth, you let her believe that. I shook my head, forcing myself to stay focused. Why did you cheat? And why with him? Why would you risk getting pregnant by Henry? Why not go back on birth control and pretend you wanted to wait longer to have a baby? You could have slept with him without the risk. Emma looked down, avoiding my gaze. I don't know, she said quietly. I was lonely. You were gone so much. I was aroused and Henry was there. We started talking, and before I realized it, we were already close. I knew he wasn't looking for anything serious. She hesitated, clearly struggling with her next words. As for the birth control, I was already seeing Henry before we decided to try for a baby. He refuses to use condoms, so I'd shower after to reduce the risk. I know it wasn't the safest method, but I thought it was my best option. I scoffed, my sarcasm cutting. Keeping your legs closed would have been a better option. Emma flinched, her eyes wide with shock. I hoped she wouldn't shut down. I still needed answers. So you cheated on me for 4 months before you got pregnant, I continued. And then you kept it going for another 2 months after? She nodded, her shame palpable. I suspected I might be pregnant, but I didn't want to stop until I was sure. I justified it by thinking if I was already pregnant, it didn't matter if I kept seeing him. Her words stung. She winced, realizing how callous they sounded. Henry ended things when I told him about the baby, she admitted. He didn't want to risk you finding out and having to be responsible if Grace turned out to be his. So you two discussed your options, I said flatly. Yes, she replied, her voice barely audible. We thought you'd never suspect Grace wasn't yours, and there was a good chance she wasn't his, especially since you came home that week in July. We were together constantly. I didn't see Henry at all while you were home, she added. So, while I was away working to support the life we wanted, you were having an affair, I said, piecing it together. Was it resentment because I wasn't around, or... I stopped, biting back the harsher accusation on the tip of my tongue. Emma shook her head quickly, as if trying to dispel any accusations. No, it wasn't like that, she insisted. It was purely physical. I felt a spark of desire when you were away, and Henry happened to be there. We only saw each other when you were out of town, meeting at his place 3 or 4 nights a week. We were careful, I didn't stay overnight every time, and I made sure it seemed like I was home most of the time. At work, we kept things strictly professional. No one would have guessed we were more than colleagues. Her words sounded rehearsed, as though she had been justifying her actions to herself for months. And no, she added almost defensively, he's not better in bed. We didn't do anything you and I don't already do. It wasn't about that. It was just that he was there when you weren't. It was fun and exciting, that's all. And no, I didn't do it to hurt you or get back at you. It was something I did for me. Her blunt honesty stung, slicing through me like a blade. It was as if she'd convinced herself that her actions were somehow reasonable, even harmless. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to maintain eye contact. If you were only mine when I was around, then you were never really mine, I said flatly. You were my wife, but his mistress. You were so careful not to get caught. But then you got pregnant. I exhaled sharply, my voice dripping with bitterness. Did it ever cross your mind what would happen if I found out years later that our child wasn't mine? Maybe from a blood type mismatch or because she didn't look like the others, assuming you didn't cheat again and let someone else father the next one. Or go back to Henry for another. Emma's eyes widened, and she shook her head frantically. No. I promised myself I'd never cheat again, she said desperately. And I knew once you bonded with Grace, you'd never leave her, even if she wasn't biologically yours. Look at you. You've been so devoted to that baby. Even Henry agrees. I laughed bitterly. Points for you, I guess, I snapped. So, you and Henry discussed the possibility that she's his? You said he called yesterday to check on you. It's obvious you've both been planning how to manage me, keeping me in the dark, preparing for my reaction." Emma shifted uncomfortably, her hands fidgeting in her lap. And the key word here is was, as in I was invested in being Grace's dad, I said icily. "Both moms have already noticed. I haven't held her once. I haven't changed her diaper, swaddled her, or even taken more than a glance from across the room. If the DNA test shows she's mine, I'll step up. But until then." I locked eyes with her, my tone unwavering. "Tell me, did it ever really matter to you whether I was her father or Henry?" Emma hesitated before answering, her voice soft but unflinching. "Of course, I wanted you to be her father. But once I knew I was pregnant, all I cared about was having the baby. I knew she'd be adorable, and you'd never suspect anything. You and Henry look similar enough, same hair color, same build. You'd be her dad, and it wouldn't matter." Her words were like a slap to the face, leaving me reeling. "You know, I've been cutting back on offshore work," I said bitterly. "I gave up bonuses and started managing things from the office just to be home more. I even took a pay cut. You seemed happy I was around, or so I thought. If my being away was such a problem, you could have just said something. All you had to do was ask. Everything I did was for you." Emma broke down, crying harder now, but it didn't move me. Her tears had lost their power over me. "Well, that's about to change," I said, my tone firm. "If I'm not the father, I'm going back to the rigs. I'll stay out there until I find someone who actually wants to be with me, and only me. Someone who can keep their vows and their legs closed when I'm not around." Her sobs grew louder, but I barely registered them. "But I need you to help with the baby," she pleaded through her tears. "We're a family. What about us? We've done so well these past 7 months. I've been a devoted wife. I haven't looked at another man since then. We could try counseling." I shook my head, my voice flat. "Right now, I'm not sure there's still an US. If the DNA test proves Grace is mine, we'll figure things out. But for now, I'm not staying here. I've already packed what matters to me." Emma's face crumpled in shock. "Where will you go?" she whispered. "I rented an apartment last week," I said, my tone icy. "I wanted to wait until after the baby was born before leaving. Paul will stay with you for now, and maybe my mom will help too. She's hoping Grace is her grandchild." Without another word, I turned and walked out. Behind me, Emma's sobs softened but didn't stop. In the hallway, I almost bumped into Paul and my mom, who were standing just outside the door. "Yeah, we heard," Paul admitted bitterly. "NUS. But don't give up hope. There's still a chance for reconciliation, especially if Grace is your daughter." I turned to her, my voice sharp. "Really? Did you miss the part where she never apologized?" "Not once. She doesn't feel guilt, just loneliness and arousal as excuses. She doesn't even care who Grace's father is. She just expects me to accept it. It's revolting." Paul looked stunned, her eyes welling with tears. Mom stepped in, her voice calm but firm. "We moved the car seat and secured it. I'm going to pack a bag and stay here for a few days. Even if you're not the father, Emma's been like a daughter to me for 6 years. I can't just walk away, not yet. But don't get me wrong, I'm furious too. If she hadn't just had a baby, Paul and I would have told her exactly how foolish she's been." I nodded, appreciating her honesty. When they asked, I gave them the address of my new apartment but didn't mention the lawyer or the steps I'd taken to secure my share of the assets. Divorce papers were already being drafted, citing infidelity. Although Emma would be homebound for a few days, I couldn't risk her accessing our finances online. I took precautions, knowing our marriage was likely beyond repair. The small flicker of doubt I had, sparked by memories of the happiness we once shared, had completely extinguished. Trusting her again felt impossible. On my way to the new apartment, I called Michael. I needed someone to talk to over a drink. I had initially planned to take a few weeks off work after the baby was born to help my wife adjust, sort of like a male version of maternity leave, but now the thought of being alone was unbearable. Michael, with his flexible schedule, met me at a nearby bar. He worked for his father-in-law's company, though he doubted he'd stay long after Anna's confession. You talked to Emma, didn't you? Michael asked as we sat down. I nodded and shared the details of our conversation. I've already consulted the same lawyer you used. Luckily, Anna's father insisted on a prenup when we got married. He wanted to protect his business. Anna owns some stock, but she doesn't get dividends or hold any real power. She'll keep that, but I'll get almost everything else. Michael already knew that Emma would be entitled to half of our shared assets, a significant sum given her solid income and our combined contributions. I was hoping to find a way to avoid paying alimony. Perhaps Paul could help with that. As for child support, it all depended on the DNA test results, though I still doubted Grace was mine. This is going to cost me, I grumbled. The courts always find a way to punish the guy, even when he's done nothing wrong. Michael nodded sympathetically. Daniel and I went to see Mark, Bennett's husband, and told him about her affair with Henry, he said. As expected, he was furious. Daniel, being a cop, warned him not to do anything reckless. I raised an eyebrow. And how did Mark take that? Michael shrugged. He was mad at us too, called us weak for not confronting Henry immediately. Daniel surprised me by saying, "Who said anything about letting that idiot off easy? I told Mark not to do anything stupid, nothing that'll get him caught. Henry isn't worth going to jail over. Mark may have a quick temper, but he's not an idiot." Michael smirked. Mark's exact words were, "So I just need to make sure I don't get caught when someone deals with Henry." We joked about it until he calmed down. I chuckled darkly. Henry needs to be dealt with, but it has to be done carefully. And no, castrating him isn't the answer. Michael gave me a baffled look. You've lost your mind if you think we're letting him off lightly. Even if he can't have kids anymore, he's still responsible for the mess he's made. Destroying marriages, yours, mine, and probably Mark's. Daniel might stay with Sarah for now because of the kids, but that'll depend on how she reacts when he confronts her tonight. He's been putting it off because of everything happening with you. Henry's lies are already crumbling, I said. Once these women warn him, he'll start running. But disappearing completely is harder than he thinks. He can't make the kind of money he's used to while staying off the grid. And if we've already found for women he's been with, there are probably more. It's like shaking a haystack and seeing how many needles fall out. We need to find the other husbands who might have a score to settle. Michael laughed at the metaphor. As for punishment, I think he should keep at least one testicle. I raised an eyebrow. Why just one? If he loses both, he can take hormone replacements and still have sex, I explained. But leaving him with one damaged maybe would mess with him physically and psychologically. It'd make repeating this behavior difficult without crossing a line. Michael burst out laughing, already planning to share my twisted logic with Daniel and Mark. 2 days later, I stopped by the house I used to call home. Paul opened the door, her expression cold. You didn't waste any time, did you? What do you want? She snapped. Emma got the divorce papers this morning, I said, feeling a mix of guilt and relief. She's been crying nonstop since then. The only time she seems calm is when she's caring for Grace. I doubt she'll even think about another relationship after this. Is there any chance for reconciliation if you try counseling? Paul asked, clinging to hope. I shook my head. I've already decided there's no future for us. This just confirms it, I said, handing her the paternity test results. The baby isn't mine. Paul stared at the envelope, tears streaming down her face as the reality hit her. Heartbroken, she turned to deliver the news to her daughter. I'd already told my mother, who was equally devastated. Losing the chance to be Grace's grandmother hurt her deeply, but her anger over Emma's betrayal kept her from being there when the results came in. She, too, was a casualty of Emma and Henry's deceit. The entire town was buzzing with gossip about Henry Dawson and his affairs. In the days that followed, Michael, Daniel, April, and I confronted our wives, exposing the full extent of Henry's manipulation. We refused to let shame silence us, openly sharing how he had preyed on our marriages. Henry's charm had worked too well. His bragging, smooth talk, and audacity drew women into his orbit, even those in seemingly happy marriages. As his infidelities became public knowledge, More fathers demanded paternity tests, uncovering at least 2 more children he had fathered. Suspicious husbands began questioning their wives, and counseling offices filled with couples trying to salvage what was left of their relationships. The full extent of Henry's actions didn't come to light until he made a confession directly to the police. You'd think someone living Henry's lifestyle would keep his assets liquid, ready to vanish at a moment's notice. Instead, he tied up his income in physical investments. He bought a house, poured money into multiple real estate properties, and indulged in an extravagant lifestyle. His home boasted valuable artwork on the walls, alongside the usual hunting and fishing gear common in our area. Even his boat was top of the line, equipped for both water skiing and fishing. While law enforcement initially seemed disinterested, Henry's lifestyle made him vulnerable. Even if he had liquidated his assets and fled, private investigators would have tracked him down. Escaping completely is almost impossible when your social security number is tied to any legitimate high-income job. Henry didn't fully comprehend the danger he was in. By staying in the area instead of disappearing immediately, he underestimated the rage of the husbands he had wronged, and paid dearly for it. Just days after his affairs became public knowledge, Henry was discovered on the sidewalk outside his house during his morning jog. He was barely conscious and in a state of shock. A passing jogger found him and called for an ambulance. His arms were bound behind his back, and when she tried to roll him over, he screamed in pain. She stopped, fearing she might cause further injury. When paramedics arrived, they found his groin had been severely crushed with a 3B sledgehammer. Daniel, the cop among us, shared this gruesome detail with me, Michael, and April during one of our bar nights. He recounted it with a mix of cheerfulness and gravity, even mentioning how 2 detectives jokingly advised him, "If you ever find yourself holding a 3B hammer with mysterious tissue on it, toss it in the swamp." "I didn't have anything to do with what happened to Henry," Daniel said with a sly wink, his smirk betraying his amusement. "I'm just passing along what my colleagues said." Henry had no idea who attacked him. He remembered hearing the doorbell ring in the dark. Whether it was late at night or early in the morning, he couldn't say. He had been groggy from sleep. "I think they used a taser," Henry told investigators. "They shocked me down there a few times. I remember that much. I think there were 2 of them, but I'm not sure. One of them said something about not messing with another man's wife. After that, it was just unbearable pain." Desperate for justice, Henry provided the police with the names of every woman he had been involved with, married and single. The list was shockingly long. With so many leads to follow, the investigation became a logistical nightmare. There were plenty of suspects, but no solid evidence. The timing of the attack also made alibis nearly impossible to verify. Privately, Daniel admitted to Michael and me that the detectives working the case felt Henry had gotten exactly what he deserved. After a few months, the investigation inevitably stalled and was closed. Emma and I divided our assets. She received half, which included proceeds from the sale of our house. A new family moved in, and their little girl occupied the nursery I had carefully painted with whimsical animal designs. I could only hope she appreciated the love that went into it. Emma moved back in with her mother. Caring for Grace alone was too much for her, but at least she had Paul for support. As for me, I no longer cared about Emma's romantic life. She called me once to apologize, likely prompted by Paul. However, she didn't specify what she was apologizing for, the infidelity, the pregnancy, or how everything fell apart. I didn't ask. By then, I had no interest in rekindling any connection. When she suggested meeting to talk, I declined. Her next question was about Henry. She wanted to know if I had any involvement in what happened to him. I simply replied, "He got what he deserved," and ended the call. After that, all communication between us was handled through our lawyers. I occasionally wondered how much Emma would spend trying to legally compel Henry to pay child support. He wasn't the type to comply willingly, but the courts would eventually force him. Still, the process would drain her financially. Henry was already juggling several similar lawsuits, and efforts were underway to freeze his real estate assets. Between legal fees, medical bills, and looming child support payments, his extravagant lifestyle was crumbling. assuming he managed to keep his job at all. 18 months later, I found myself standing at the lower rail of the Econ 626 rig in the Gulf of Mexico. The cool autumn breeze was invigorating, and my windbreaker kept the chill at bay. This was one of my final routine visits to the rigs before I made a long-overdue career change. I'd met someone, a woman who made me feel alive again, and was ready to explore a future with her. It was finally time to accept the job at headquarters I'd declined twice before. As I unzipped my jacket, my hand brushed against the lump hanging over my belt. Its presence puzzled me. I had tried to let it go many times but couldn't bring myself to do it. It didn't make sense to keep it. The risk far outweighed any benefit. Yet, strangely, it gave me comfort, a reminder that I had reclaimed control over my life. Without thinking further, I pulled out the heavy hammer and hurled it into the sea. It sank swiftly into the dark waters, vanishing from sight. Looking back, I realized that moment in the hospital when I walked out on Emma and Grace was the beginning of my transformation. For a while, life felt like a blur. Detached and unmoored, I watched events unfold as if from a distance, powerless to change anything. Work became my anchor, but even the rig, once a sanctuary, grew suffocating. The small apartment I rented near our old home was as impersonal as a motel room. I didn't bother furnishing it much. There didn't seem to be a point. Most of my time was spent at work or at the bar, nursing beers and trying to piece together what remained of my pride. But now, with the hammer gone and the past slipping further behind me, I finally felt ready to embrace the unknown. It's strange how everything crumbles all at once, like a dam giving way after the tiniest fracture. Were Emma and I ever truly good? Or was that just the story I told myself? Maybe I had been blind, ignoring the warning signs because facing the truth, that our marriage had fractured long before Henry slithered into our lives, was too painful. For weeks after I left, I wrestled with whether I should see Grace again. My mother kept asking, "Have you gone to see the baby yet?" As if holding her would magically mend everything. But how could I look at her without questioning if she was really mine? I told myself I'd wait for the DNA results before making any decisions, but even when they confirmed what I feared, that I wasn't her father, I couldn't let go. There was a part of me, no matter how irrational, still drawn to her. Not to Emma, but to Grace, the baby I had prepared for, the life I had envisioned. Walking away felt like abandoning not just Emma, but a piece of myself. Eventually, I went back. Not for Emma, but for Grace. It wasn't a grand reunion or a sweeping emotional moment. Paul opened the door without a word, handed me the baby, and I sat down on the same couch where I once pictured our family's future. I held Grace in my arms, staring at her tiny face, searching for clarity. But all I saw were the shadows of Henry's betrayal and Emma's deceit. Grace was blameless in all of it, yet that didn't make it easier. It didn't erase the pain. Paul's voice cut through the silence, grounding me in the harsh reality I couldn't escape. "You're not the father," she said softly but firmly, as though trying to convince herself as much as me. "You don't owe anything." I left without another glance. That was the last time I saw Grace. After that day, I made a deliberate choice to move on. By move on, I mean I buried myself in work, anything to keep my mind too occupied to dwell on the past. I finally accepted the job at headquarters I'd been putting off, swapping my offshore routine for a desk in the city. The change in pace was disorienting at first, but no matter how far I tried to run, the echoes of what had happened still followed me. Over time, something unexpected happened. I met someone new. Her name was Nora, and she was unlike anyone I had ever known. There was a quiet strength about her, a calmness I hadn't realized I needed until she was there. We met through mutual friends, and casual dinners turned into something more. She didn't push me to talk about Emma or the wreckage I was still navigating, but she listened when I was ready to share, even if all I could offer were fragments of a broken story. With Nora, everything felt different. She made me believe in a future again, one where the past didn't dictate who I had to be. Slowly, cautiously, I opened up to her, and she did the same with me, trusting me with her own stories, her own scars. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And after everything, I realized that was enough. It's been 3 years since I walked out of that hospital room. Emma and I never spoke again except through lawyers. Grace is someone else's responsibility now, and I've learned to accept that. I still think about her sometimes, but the memories are fading. And as for Henry, he got what was coming to him. Even now, there are nights when I think about the hammer, what it represented and why I held on to it for so long. Maybe it was my way of clinging to control, a reminder that even when my life collapsed, I wasn't entirely powerless. But when I finally hurled it into the sea, it felt like a release, a final goodbye to the man I used to be. Now, with Nora by my side, I'm learning to become someone new, someone better. The scars of the past remain, but they don't define me anymore. I'm not the man who lost everything. I'm the man who chose to rebuild. And for the first time in a long time, I've realized that's enough.